Hi everyone, this is Hardy. In this lecture we will check out some cool techniques for rendering trees and foliage. The plants and greenery that we include in our environment paintings can do lots of great things to help us get our ideas across. First of all, trees and plants are all just so naturally beautiful that they bring a lot of built-in charm and appeal to our paintings. Since they can take almost any shape, they can be great composition framing devices or fillers for large areas that you want to be nondescript. They just make environment paintings feel more alive and inviting, so as environment artists this is definitely an area that we want to be a strength. Now there are tons of different ways to paint trees and foliage with Photoshop. I'll admit I have struggled with this over the years. Here's the main challenge. Trees, bushes, and grass are all comprised of thousands of tiny elements. Blades of grass, leaves, twigs. When you look out into a forest, there's just so much to process. Now, Photoshop has the power to let you render every single one of these tiny elements if you choose to. In fact, most Photoshop tree or foliage painting tutorials use some variation of a custom brush designed to paint hundreds of leaves in a few brush strokes. That's cool, but the problem with that is you end up with a painting that is so visually active, so cluttered and overpopulated that it just becomes hard to look at and ends up feeling computer generated and kind of phony. Now, there is no single right way to do any of this, but one answer that has really been working for me is to get kind of impressionistic. Let's try to simulate the way that traditional painters use brushes to give the impression of leaves and foliage without actually describing each one. This gives us a much more artful and visually pleasing effect. We can use those active shapes in certain places of focus, but for the most part, we let our foliage stay subtle and subdued, the way it's interpreted in our minds when we observe nature in real life. We'll go over a few techniques here for getting great looking trees and foliage. I'd encourage you to use all of these methods together rather than relying too heavily on any one alone. First of all, let's look at trees. I've got a vague scene set up here that's basically just some colors indicating a forest and some atmospheric perspective to give it a bit of depth. This will be a great starting point for this exercise, since this phase is when I would usually start painting in some realistic looking trees. I always start a tree with a silhouette. Let's try the paint by hand method first. I just used a basic round brush for this, and I start blocking in the general tree trunk and some main large branches. Tree trunks can often just be straight, but try to include some points of interest, maybe an old knothole or a broken branch, some area where the bark has fallen away. These little details really help tell a story and make your tree more interesting. Once we have these main items in place, let's start adding some secondary branches. You can use the same brush but shrink it down to progressively smaller diameters as the branches, well, branch. I find that I get a nicer effect if I paint branches with a little flick of the wrist rather than trying to slowly scroll along. Give your branches all kinds of unexpected twists and turns, and it's even cool to paint part of one and then erase it away, kind of chop it off to give it an abrupt end, and then you start a new line at that cut point. It gives the effect of a branch that broke at some point and then started to grow again. A very cool effect, kind of have to think like nature. Make your branches fork and shrink as you taper out to finer and finer divisions. Okay, now for some Photoshop magic. Once you've got a few nice secondary branches painted in, you can just copy and paste them. As long as you transform them a bit, they'll look different enough not to seem like a duplicate. Even with this hand painting technique, it's incredibly easy to get a lot of detail on the canvas in a pretty short amount of time if you just repeat this process. Okay, next, let's create a different tree using custom shapes over here. This is almost too easy. Using custom shapes, either those that you've downloaded or created yourself, you can drag out entire tree silhouettes in a couple of clicks. Look how much detail fills the canvas almost instantaneously. Now, I would certainly recommend using a variety of custom shapes to give your trees some variation and just so that you feel like you're creating something rather than just dropping a stamp onto the page. Add some dead branches or even put one tree shape on top of another to give it all kinds of unexpected personality and twists and turns. Now that we have our basic tree silhouettes in place, let's add some bark detail. I do this with custom shapes as well, but we'll need to make sure that we add these on their own layer since we'll just be using them as a selection. More on that later. These rock shapes actually work really well for this, but we stretch them out vertically quite a bit. They start to look like all of those cool striations that you would expect to see in tree bark. After we've added a few of these shapes, let's hide this layer and create a new one. Now remember, if we command click on a layer, it will create a selection of all the pixels on that layer. So let's command click these tree bark patterns to create a selection. Great. Now I'll hit Command H to hide the selection, and we can paint within the selection with a subtle color. See how that works? I try to keep tree bark fairly subdued since it's mostly going to be covered with foliage, but do whatever your painting and lighting scheme dictates. Pretty cool, a nice indication of a tree trunk. Okay, now it's time to add in some leaves. Here's where we'll use that impressionistic technique that I mentioned earlier. On this kind of bare tree trunk, let's add in some silhouette shapes of some leaves out here on these branches. I'll use this custom brush called Shrub for this, but basically we're just adding in some dark silhouettes that will hold our highlight color later, so these shapes will be covered up and aren't super important. Okay, that works pretty well. Some indications of foliage out on these branches. Now let's use this really cool brush called Foliage 3. Here's a quick look at what this brush does. I've got a pretty bright greenish yellow color picked, and I'll set the brush to 100% flow and opacity, full blast. Let's paint in a few little shapes. See how it kind of looks like a paintbrush daubing the canvas rather than some computer-generated leaf particles? That's the effect we're going for, and it's a great way to avoid that overly active computer-generated look I mentioned earlier. Okay, now let's paint some highlights on these areas of foliage silhouette that we've defined. There are all kinds of brush shape dynamics at work to give this one a nice varied look, and with just a few taps, we can create some really nice highlights in very little time. Here's another cool effect that I like to use. If you've got these highlights on their own layer, try changing their color. Let's hit Command U to bring up hue saturation. I'll adjust the lightness and saturation to make them a little bit darker and less intense green. Let's also hit Command B to try a color balance adjustment. If we make these seem a bit more blue or cyan, it starts to look like these clumps of leaves are now in shadow. Now, let's use the history brush to bring back some of that bright color in a few selective areas. To do that, we just put a check mark on the history panel on the last recorded operation before we did that hue saturation adjustment. And then let's just grab our history brush from our toolbar, or you can just hit Y on your keyboard. Now, if we subtly paint back in some of that bright yellowish green, kind of going back in time in our history panel, it almost looks like the sun is filtering through the canopy above and only hitting certain parts of the foliage below. Such a cool effect. It really makes you feel like you're in a forest. Now, after this, you can hand paint in some other little leaf shapes just to give it some variation and a more hand-wrought effect. Again, we should never rely on just one technique too heavily. And with how cool these are, it's kind of easy to get carried away. Okay, cool. We are now master tree painters. Now let's check out some similar techniques for rendering shrubs and grassy areas. This really works pretty much the same way as rendering trees, except we don't have to worry about branches or tree trunks. I've got a little hill or path defined here in the foreground. Right now it's pretty much just a dark, vaguely rocky looking area, but I've got a custom shape to indicate some shrub silhouettes as well. Okay, let's paint in some foliage and bring this to life. First, let's use that same brush that we used for trees, Foliage 3. I'll use the exact same marks to indicate some foliage in these shrubby areas. We can even use those color modulation and history brush tricks that we use for the tree exercise to give these shrubs some shadows and highlights. Very cool stuff. I've got one more really cool brush that I'd like to share called Grass 2. We can use this to kind of speckle in some grassy areas where there aren't any bushes. Start with a larger brush in the foreground and then shrink it down as these lines of grass get farther away. It creates this really cool surface compression effect that can add some serious depth. Before we finish this lecture, let's check out a great way to artfully use photo textures to add a bit of interest. I love this zoomed in photo of some fuzzy algae stuff growing between train tracks. This area in the middle makes a really great texture for some grassy, rocky terrain that I often need to use. Let's put this photo in a layer group and then set that layer group to soft light blending mode. Just like that, we get all of the cool texture from this photo, but it doesn't cover up all of your cool painting beneath. Erase and transform the photo as needed to make it fit. You can also dial back the opacity if the effect is a little too strong. Remember to use all of these techniques together, and you'll have a really balanced, artful look to your work. Okay, I look forward to seeing some great looking trees and foliage in your paintings.